relationships. In Europe, people strive toward a deep, lifelong commitment. For American, small talk, meaning small talk is talking when you really don't mean anything. And that's a positive thing. Cocktail party is a typical American invention. Where people come together and they talk to each other half an hour without saying anything. But there is a possibility to meet many people, to share your idea, to exchange business cards, and then you go to the next person, and you try to meet as many as possible. A European often feels that a small talk is rather a negative thing. You know, why does he talk if he doesn't say anything? And often in parties or cocktail situations, receptions, Europeans look for one or two people, and then they stand in a corner and they have a deep discussion and they spend a long time with the same person. That's a difference. It's good to understand that, because don't expect that American who asks how are you really wants to know all your life. He may turn his back and walk away before you have even started your answer, and you are offended until you realize that how are you is not a question, it's a greeting. Actually, you may answer it one other way or not, but it's not a beginning of a deep conversation normally for Americans. For many Europeans it is. Americans want to have as many contacts as possible. The Europeans tend to protect their privacy. European is so much populated, so tightly populated continent that people want to protect their privacy. They build houses with walls around them. They use curtains in front of the windows. They don't want to show their life to the whole world. American culture is more open, contact-oriented, less protective, bold in that sense. And actually, it comes from how do you divide your life? American has practically two areas in his life. There's the private area and the public area. What is not private, which you don't keep just for yourself, is public. And you know, it's public, open for everybody. For most Europeans, especially in the Germanic and Scandinavian cultures, there are three areas. There's a private area, a confidential or semi-private area, and a public area. The semi-confidential area is an area which you share with one or two friends, and you expect them to keep your secrets. This has been one of the major areas of conflict between European and American agape stuff. A Finn or a German or a Swiss person shares something confidentially with an American and does not realize that the American does not have that area of confidentiality. And then he comes back and he cries, and I said, I thought he was my friend. You know, I told this about myself, and then he printed it in his prayer letter, and he brought it up in a prayer meeting as a prayer request. And he betrayed my confidentiality. And I thought he was my friend. And the American wanted to provide a service because it was shared with him, it was public, so he wanted to get more people to pray for it. And I have seen a lot of tears, maybe not 100 discussions or situations, but scores of them anyway, where Europeans and Americans have had wounds in their lives. The European because American has betrayed their trust, like they feel. And Americans because the Europeans have reacted in a strange way, suddenly withdrawing and being hurt by something which the American did not consciously do wrong at all. In his values, he did what was right. For a European value, he did what was wrong. So it's good when you share about your life with some other people to agree upon, you know, the degree of confidentiality. If you don't want the American to talk about it to anybody, then you say, I don't want you to talk about this with anybody. can you keep the secret? If you are my friend, you keep this secret. And then it clicks and he starts to understand it. Or if you don't say that, don't be offended if it is shared. I come from a culture where the confidential area is extremely strong. Like I'm an ordained minister, and it's even in the church law that if people tell some things to me confidentially, you know, and I tell it to somebody else, I lose my job if I am pastor of a church, for instance. It's so absolute. You do it once and you are out. That's like in a Catholic church in the same way, but it functions in the friendships in the same way. You betray the confidentiality and you are not a friend anymore in some European cultures. Now, we all grow when we meet others, and my confidential area has become looser. I understand when people talk about things which are shared in a more personal way. I understand that there are situations when you share with a few people, but it's always good to check, you know, can I talk about this with Eine? Can I talk about this with our team? And if a person says, I don't feel comfortable about that, then don't. And that definition helps when you together with the other person make an agreement. Then I still have another area, and that is the logic. In different cultures, people come to the conclusions in their thinking patterns and decision making in different ways, in very different ways. And we all have been brought up in our home cultures to make decisions, to think in a certain method, and we feel that is the logic. And people who think in a different way, from our point of view, are always illogical. But it's not so. There are just different ways to develop a topic, to communicate, and to make conclusions. The American way is linear. Linear logic means that if you go into one direction, you have a clear goal. You have point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, point 5, and then you make a conclusion. And it functions well. You can create good mathematics that way, and business and science and technology. But you don't compose a symphony with that logic. The Americans, if this is a line between positive and negative, the Americans work always in the positive side. When they need to make a decision, they gather the positive information about that topic, and then they make a decision. The British think linearly mostly, but they are more in the negative side. They try to see the problems too. And the solution, which includes the least problems, is yours often. But both of them think often in the one dimensional way. I was just in Great Britain for 2 weeks, and I talked with some of my fellow teachers in a conference about this, and they realized, they sensed the difference between them and the Americans very clearly. They said the Americans ignore the negative side, so they don't have the full knowledge of the issue when they make decisions. We try to consider everything when we come to decisions, but mostly then the problem areas affect us when we make the decision. But this is linear way of thinking. You go to Latin Europe or you go to Africa, and you realize that there's a totally different way of making decisions, and that's contextual. An African who talks about an issue, he paints a picture. Everything is included. He does not need to have a point. Or Latins in Europe often do it. This logic is very common in Southern Europe. people paint a picture with their words. When they discuss, it's a long discussion. People talk and talk and talk and talk. And a person who comes from a linear culture asks, when do they come to the point? The point is that there is no point. The whole discussion is the answer to the question. At a certain point, then, certain time, they start to agree, they reach a consensus. And then they all agree. They say, yes, yes, I see the picture now. When I was in Nigeria, in Kefi, where some of our Agape staff have been teaching in a teacher training college, there was an American, good linear thinking teacher, Agape teacher. And I saw how a student, a young man, was late. And he came and they had a long talk and I watched it from a distance. And the guy talked and talked. And the American teacher got impatient. And finally he said to the boy, you know, you never come to the point. And then the guy started to talk about everything, the sick grandmother and the chicken which ran over the road and whatever. And when finally I talked with that teacher, I asked how she felt about that discussion. And she said, this man just goes around the issue and never comes to the point. Was he illogical? No. He was contextual. And the teacher was a part of that context. And when he felt that he was not communicating with the teacher, he felt he was not communicating well, so he started to go through the issue again and again and paint a picture again. You know, if you see a painting, you don't say, okay, the point is there, because the whole painting is a context. Everything affects everything. There may be a house, and it may have in that painting a certain color of curtains, and that gives a character to the whole painting. It changes what is elsewhere. And that's the way people think in Africa. Very often I talked with the Africans about that. And I realized that in the way they communicate, words mean a lot. In contextual logic, you may not create a lot of science. You write novels with that logic and produce art, and especially you produce relationships. Because truth depends on relationship, not just the accuracy. And every person with whom you talk is part of that context, and it affects the whole picture. It's a very dynamic way of thinking, and some of the great thinkers of the world have been contextual. If this is more linear logic in the British Isles, maybe in Europe and in America, contextual is very often expressed in Southern Europe. But in Central Europe, especially in Germany, there's a dialectical logic. It's very difficult to explain what it is. You're turning the cassette, I guess, yes. So, the dialectical logic is difficult to explain. Sometimes people say that it was Hegel who invented this logic, and I want to challenge that. Hegel, by the way, is a very difficult guy to understand. They tell a story about him that when he had written his main book, he had the manuscript ready and he finished the last page, and then he said, it's over. And he went to the window and took a deep breath of fresh air and opened the window, and wind came in and all the pages blew all over the room, and he was never able to put them in the right order again. So that's how dialectical method was born. I don't believe that was the way. Actually, I don't think Hegel invented it. He only wrote down how Germans had been thinking for generations. That's built into the nature of German. The key word is tension, creative tension. You say something or think something, and the next thing which comes into your mind or the other person's mind is yes, but. You have to say the other side. The first point which you say or think is thesis, and then another person, or you yourself in your thinking, produce the antithesis. And there's a tension, and that tension is an unresolved problem until you find a synthesis. A synthesis is not a compromise. A compromise is something where you give up from both thesis and antithesis, and you're in a middle ground. A thesis, a synthesis is not a compromise where you give up of anything, but a new invention, a higher level of truth, which satisfies the prerequisites and the axioms of both thesis and antithesis. And so you reach a higher level after that tension. But then this synthesis becomes a new thesis, and somebody comes and produces the antithesis. And you have the same situation again, and then you find a higher level of truth, a new synthesis, and so that's the way the discussion develops or thinking develops. It's a very time-consuming and emotion-consuming way of thinking, because you are always in a tension. You may not develop science, technology through that. You develop politics and philosophy through that kind of thinking. And you compose symphonies which are full of those tensions. You listen to Beethoven and you realize that that's dialectical music. And Bach too. There are tensions which are solved in a new creative way, and you feel that when you listen to the symphonies. Then partly I feel France is in this dialectical logic too, but even more common to me in France is what I call existential logic. The home countries of existential thinking pattern, which is not the same as existentialism as a philosophy necessarily, but it is a thinking pattern, and that is expressed partly in France and very much in Scandinavia. Again, that means that you have to have an experimental leap of faith to the new truth. You grasp something which is not yet there. You are intuitive. And maybe the best way for me to explain this is in the communication pattern. There are two people discussing, and one of them wants to communicate an idea to the other. In a linear culture, he would just tell the facts, and the other person accepts the facts, and that's it. In an existential culture, the first question this person, the communicator, would ask is, what is the emotional background in my heart which makes me think this way? Second question, how could I create the same emotional response in the heart of that person? And also he would grasp this truth. And so he communicates in an irrational level with the other person, and through the rational level using words. At the same time, when his words arrive, the other person feels that he's just discovering the same himself. In an existential culture, people don't communicate so much with facts. For an existentialist, facts are not enough to convince him about anything. People communicate with experiences, with parables, aphorisms, poems, metaphors, drama, music, illustrations with each other. That's very much my culture. I have been built that way. I remember when I was in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, that we had a French guy, Daniel, as I was associate staff actually, there doing his military service, and they sent him to Abidjan to help to Mali actually, but he came to Abidjan to meet me. And here I was helping Kasum Keita there, our Western European director, West African director. And the time of Daniel was coming to the end, and he had to make a plan for his future. I had an American good staff member who is nowadays in Europe. With me in the car, Daniel, he and I were traveling together. We discussed Daniel's future. And we analyzed it, and Daniel said, I know this, and this, and this, and these are the alternatives. And then my friend from America started to get a little impatient. And he snapped his fingers and he said, Daniel, you have all the facts there, you just make a decision like that. Daniel was very surprised. He turned to my friend and said, but I must be convinced. He was an existential thinker, and for an existentialist, facts are never enough to convince him. He needed to know that his heart was with it. I still remember that discussion because that to me, that moment made it click to me to see the difference between linear and existential communication. None of these is right, none of this is wrong. It all depends on whether you work in a culture where you are understood. And we all learn the kind of linear culture when we go to school and we think through mathematics, for instance. If we study literature, we learn to see contextual culture a little, and so on. But when it becomes important in our lives, that we make the big decisions, and when situations become difficult, then we all go back to our home culture, the logic which is unique to us. You know, a Finn doesn't choose a wife by calculating, the good qualities together and deducting the sum of the bad qualities and then making a decision. It happens in the existential way. I don't know, maybe the Germans do it in a dialectical way. I don't know. But you don't, even choosing a house. I have seen how Kari and Sari have been choosing a house. They did not only work in the area of fact, they had to fall in love with that plan before the decision was clear. It happened very quickly, by the way. And but that's a very typical thing to do. So none of this is better than the other or worse than the other. It's not a matter of rights and wrongs. The key is how to communicate people who are different so that they really understand. So it's good to ask, did you understand me? I remember when I heard this John Braun in America in my first Campus Crusade conference talking the first time, and he made points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He used quotes from different people. Dwight Eisenhower says this, and Lyndon B. Johnson says this, and they were nice quotes, but to me it didn't prove anything, because in my culture the fact that Lyndon B. Johnson thought this way about Christianity did not make Christianity better or worse. It just showed me what Lyndon B. Johnson's opinion was. So then he came to a conclusion, and I felt, you cannot make a conclusion like that. You don't have the facts straight. You don't provide the emotional background for it. You never asked the question of yes, but what about this? And I realized that in one culture, facts are enough, or certain number of facts and quotes. In other culture, it is not. So I had to learn to communicate more in an American way and accept the way they communicate. When you go to whatever ministry you have, try to be sensitive to the logic of other people. And don't think that this person is illogical because he thinks that way. Jesus communicated somehow in all these logics. He was linear sometimes. He said, because you do this and this, this follows. And if you don't do this, also my Heavenly Father doesn't bless you. So he drew kind of linear conclusions very often. He was contextual most often. He told stories. He did not give expository teaching from the Old Testament. He told stories to people. And he painted pictures about the birds and the flowers and fishermen and nets and and mustard seeds and trees. And the truth sank into people's minds because of stories so well that those were recorded. He was dialectical, he was in heated arguments. It was a yes, but, or actually it was a no, I say to you, situation very often, extremely strong. And then he was existential very often in his communication. He communicated through parables and metaphors and miracles, which are an existential way of communication. By the way, in Europe, I believe that there is a move toward more existential logic in our thinking. The young generation in Germany most often doesn't think in a dialectical way, like the old generation does. They come from rock music culture where people go through an experience, and experiences lead them to conclusions. That's the same in Great Britain. And that's why when we communicate Jesus to the young generation, we need to see that they cannot accept often the same way to present a message than the old generation does. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges to us. I would like to move still into one more area, and that is how to use all this information. How to build bridges between different cultures, between different nationalities and people. And my first thing is, as a first step, awareness. It's important to know these things, and that's why I'm talking here, that you would not be surprised and feel that it's unfair, but you would see that there is a spectrum of different people. The second is willingness. That is the attitude. The issue is how to use the awareness of the differences, what you have. Do you write off or ignore the other person because he's different? Often we think that another person, who is different is stupid. He doesn't communicate in the same way. He just tells stories and doesn't develop the topic. He doesn't want decision making, but only brainstorming, or vice versa. Or do we react against the other people? That's another wrong thing. Sometimes we get irritated. We feel deceived when another person is different. Or do we use this information, this awareness, for him to help the other person so that we will be on the same side? I think it's one of the very key issues of all Christian communication and unity is to make a decision to be on the same side with the other person. You can use all your information, what you know about him, against that person, or you can use it for him. I'm involved in a group of people where there is a certain allergy in some human relationships in one of the other contexts outside Campus Crusade. And they try to solve this issue by making new rules in every meeting. You come together and then you have complaints about each other. Let's make decisions and make new rules. And it becomes also the code of law, a big book of laws, rules. But nothing is solved because every rule, every decision which is made, they use against each other. It becomes a tool to hit the other person. And the issue is not they're having the right rules, but having the right attitude. And that is a very important thing. In this willingness, I feel that willingness to listen. Listen to the heart of the person. What does he really mean? And asking that. I did not quite understand what you said. Could you say it again? Or you could even paraphrase, did you mean this? And then the person says, no, I didn't. Could you explain it a little more? Take time in communication. Participate in the other person's life, in discussion. Tell what you think and ask them to respond to what they understood that you said. And don't get stuck to a polarization. Don't go to the discussion where you say something and then the other person says, you said this, and then you say, didn't say that, and then the other person says, no, you did, and then it's unfruitful. Ask the person, what did you hear? And then you say, sorry, I miscommunicated. Could I say it again? Take the blame. And this way you build bridges. Then the next issue is accepting the differences. Not thinking that your logic is better, but understanding that we have been made different, and that being different is not a threat. It's the richness in the body of Christ. I remember when I was a young Christian worker, around 30, and I got invitations from 2 movements to work with them. And one of those movements had very clearly defined statement of faith, and they had very good evangelical doctrine. And they wanted me to work with them. And the other movement was very broad. It wasn't that well defined. And everybody expected in the other movement, the movement which was well defined, me to choose to work with them. And they were surprised when I chose the other one, which was People's Bible Society. And then they pushed me to the corner. They wanted to know the reason. And I had to clarify it for myself. And actually, it was this way. When I work with PBS, I think in different way from some of the other people there, but I have the freedom to be myself, to think in my way. And they have the freedom, and we fit together. If I would be in the other movement, you know, I would believe and think in the way which their statement actually clarifies, but all the time I would feel that I'm in a box because I would not even have the freedom to think in another way and change. And that did not give enough room for me. There is a blessing of that broadness of being different. The unity in the body of Christ is not based upon Christians of being similar to each other, but they're being different from each other. It's one body with different members. And if all members of the body would be exactly the same, nobody would have anything to give to the others, and he would have nothing to receive from the others, and the relationships would die. But because we are different, we have a contribution, and the other person has a contribution. And there is no Christian in the whole world who would not have something to teach to me, because he is a unique creation. He is different. Even if he received Christ yesterday, today he has a unique testimony to tell to me. And that makes relationships exciting, because we are learners, and we are unique. If 2 people always agree